By the time I was in middle school, I had become a lifelong reader. I was two things as a kid. Well, three really. I was an athlete, I was a fan of sports, and I was hooked on short stories by the time I was in 7th grade. That never left me. And I think by the time I was in college, I knew that eventually I wanted to write short stories, including One Day for the Screen. Never admired short stories more than the televised short stories that Rod Serling did for Twilight Zone. I had somewhere to be, and so apparently did someone else. And I was on a 2-lane road, not the same road in the story, which is Highway 16 in North Carolina, but a 2-lane road. And I was being tailgated literally, I'd say the distance between the car behind me and me couldn't have been more than 6 inches. That kind of aggressive. And it caused me, and I was deeply annoyed by it, angered by it. It inspired my own road rage. I think at the time, if I'd had the opportunity, I might have even pulled the fellow out of his car and given him a little bit of what for. I never forgot it though, how aggressive that particular tailgater was, and then how aggressively he passed me. And it became a story that I was going to write someday. So it began with a situation, and then it became a lot more than that. I chose the old pickup because I knew that I wanted to have a contrast between a corporate executive from the city and a person he didn't understand very well out in the country. And I thought to begin this story with a man experiencing road rage, riding right up the behind of a sky blue pickup with mud on it and a bumper sticker that says Jesus Saves, was the right way to start it. And so that's what I trusted. So I've encountered a lot of people like Wilson in the Carolinas and a lot of women who are like Wanda in the Carolinas. Particularly physically and in dress, in both cases. Wilson is an imposing Southern country fellow. What I'd say is different about him from other men like him that I've known in the South is he has a degree of intelligence that I would put in a sort of a savant type of area, and I've not known someone like that. Carolinas are very diverse. But people like Wilson and Wanda, I have tended to meet and know in the country, in small towns, in some timeless ways. My description of Wanda could just as well apply in 1965 as to 2016. And the same thing with Wilson, and the same thing with his truck. I think there's a timeless quality in the Carolinas to some people who live there, that there may not be much difference in encountering them from what it might have been like to encounter their grandparents. Yes, I've been in a number of those all over the state of North Carolina and in South Carolina. And in some cases, you can picture yourself being in those houses at times when you don't want to be there. As a kid who saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when I was 13, ever since then, certain houses that are isolated in the country, especially territory I'm not familiar with, take on almost a personality of themselves that seems a little bit ominous. So that has seeped into my consciousness really since I was an early teenager, as far as my own imagination running away with these houses. But they're there, they're everywhere. I think sometimes place can be character too. And so I did want to take time with the description of the interior of that house that would give it almost as much character as the people in it. And I think a guy like Rod Serling paid a lot of attention to place. And in writing a story like Friday Afternoon, that influence on me that came from Serling and Richard Matheson and those type of writers it finds its way into a story like that. And with good reason, it should. They are many, and most of them come from short fiction. I love novels, deeply appreciate novels, but the greatest influences on me as a writer have been the great works that can be experienced in one sitting. From quote unquote one-hit wonders like Richard Connell, who wrote The Most Dangerous Game, to Shirley Jackson, who wrote many great short stories, but for me, particularly The Lottery, stories that woke me up when I was younger continue to have an influence on me now. Writers like Jack Finney, who wrote terrific long science fiction, but my deepest appreciation for Finney was one short story called Contents of the Dead Man's Pockets. So for me, it's more than writers, it's the great stories that have been written by them. And people are always asking me, was Rod Serling an influence on you? Well, in the same way that these other writers have been. 2 or 3 Jack London stories are what I think are among the best ever written, and there are probably 20 Jack London stories that I think are almost not worth a minute of your time. Same guy. Just different levels of inspiration and genius would come along in his work. But it almost always has tended to be, for me, stories on screen or on the printed page that can be experienced entirely in one sitting and that have an effect on me that lasts. Those have been the influences on me. I only had it in mind because a situation that is ripe for conflict was ready-made for the Twilight Zone, wherever the story might go. So when I created the situation in Friday Afternoon, that was strictly a what if. What if these 2 characters end up on the same shoulder at the same time, and one of them has wronged the other, and the one who has wronged the other would love to believe that the other doesn't remember that he wronged him. That's a Twilight Zone opportunity, even though I did not create the situation thinking Twilight Zone. And then the story went somewhere I didn't plan for it to go. And I think it's because you trust your gut in writing, and being a huge fan of the Twilight Zone, it wasn't surprising when I was finished that it was a story that fit in that tradition. But I didn't sit down saying, and I never do, I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write this story in the Twilight Zone tradition. But I ended up writing that story in the Twilight Zone tradition, if you get that. I would ask him something that I really would like to know as a person who thinks about life and what may be coming after. So I think I would ask him, do I have a soul, or am I a soul? I don't know whether Rod Serling read much C.S. Lewis, but one of my favorite quotes in the world is a quote from C.S. Lewis. You do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. And I often think that Rod Serling contemplated the same question. And I feel that now he knows the answer, and I'd love to know the answer before I find out the way Bryce does in the story. I remember when Anne Serling said that and wrote that about what her dad's reaction would have been to reading it. And she did say that he was always reading stories to look for adaptable material. So I could not have been happier. There's not even an amount of money that would have made me happier as a writer than having Rod Serling's daughter, an excellent writer herself, to say that about my story. It really took me aback in wonderful ways. Yes, I was very pleased to hear that quote. Yeah. One thing about the reaction to the story is that it generates questions from readers, and I hope it generates questions about themselves. It does for me. I wrote the story, and when I reread the story, it generates questions for me, and that's a good thing. The ending of this story can be interpreted in more than one way. I always hope that a reader of this story thinks about himself or herself a little bit. Is there the possibility that we are not the only ones who know the entire truth about who we are? You wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're pretty honest with yourself, but you're not necessarily very honest with yourself at noon, or when there's something you want, or when there's something someone else is preventing you from having, or when you perceive a slight. Who you really are is in there, and it crosses your mind, crosses your heart, may not come out of your mouth. But what if you're not the only one who knows who you really are? Would that lead you to lead a better life, especially when it regards other people? I've had the occasional pastor, contact me and ask about my own religious background, because certainly there are spiritual components to the story, but I haven't tended to necessarily give them what they want, because they do seem to be asking, can I go ahead and say that this is your argument in favor of Christianity as the religion? And I tell them, well, no, it isn't. It happens to be the religious background of this man in this car who's been raised Presbyterian, and so he's going to be familiar with the Christian concept, but he may not be familiar with the possibility that when we die, maybe we are tested and we don't know it, and that could determine everything. And I don't think that belongs to any particular religion.
Hi, my name is Matthew Kaye. I'm a writer of poetry and prose, and the author of the short story collection Los Angeles, LOSS, published by Short Story America, and a longtime supporter of short fiction and particularly Short Story America Press.
And I'm John Engel. I'm a professor of literature and film and creative writing. I'm a short story writer. I've been involved in teaching film for 30 years, and I think Tim Johnston writes many stories, including the one we've been discussing, that would make terrific films.
So John, why do you think Tim Johnston's story Friday Afternoon would make an excellent film?
It has all the ingredients of a terrific film script. It has tension from the opening sentences. It has wonderful dialogue that would translate beautifully into film. It's visually potentially terrific in terms of both the outdoor scenes and the indoor scenes. And it's a combination of realism and surrealism that would make it perfect for filming. What do you think?
You said a lot of beautiful things there that I agree with. I think there's this really beautiful dichotomy between this rural beauty and this interior anguish that I think would be interesting to explore through film too. That often these kind of mundane, beautiful days can deliver very powerful stories and moments in our lives. I think that would be fun to explore. John, is there anything missing in film today that you think a film like Friday Afternoon might be able to bring back?
Well, we've talked a little bit about the Twilight Zone. Mm-hmm. And I think that the kinds of things Serling and his crews did in that show need to be brought back. They were some of the greatest pieces of filmmaking of the time. But I also think that this story would combine traditions like the Twilight Zone with the great tradition of movies based on Southern American fiction. It's fantastic, some of the terrific movies that were made earlier, and they haven't been made recently. So you've got a combination of the surrealism of the Twilight Zone and the realism, the intense social realism of Southern fiction that could be combined in this film.